and welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. I've been gripped by a 3-part documentary on BBC Two about the fugitive Lord Lucan. The Eton-educated gambler disappeared without trace in 1974, following the murder of his children's nanny, Sandra Rivett, a mystery that's baffled detectives and fascinated the press for half a century. But what makes this series so gripping is that it's told through the eyes of Sandra Rivett's son, Neil Berriman, a builder from Hampshire, and investigative journalist Glen Campbell.
Britain's biggest fugitive.
Where is Lord Lucan?
I am the son of a nanny murdered by Lord Lucan in 1974.
I have a feeling he might be alive.
If he's alive, I was going to find him.
Imagine if you thought you'd eluded justice for that long.
To catch a criminal, you have to think like a criminal.
It can't be him, can it?
Lucan documents a very personal quest for the unlikely pair in their search for the truth. It takes them all over the world, to South Africa, Mozambique, Buddhist retreats, and ultimately the east and west coasts of Australia, and involves conversations with Lucan's wife Veronica and brother Hugh. Neil was adopted as a baby, but from the moment he discovered 15 years ago that his real mum was the infamous nanny, murdered in a Belgravia townhouse, her body dumped in a mail sack, the search for justice has consumed him. Many of Lord Lucan's friends and family insist he took his own life, but no body has ever been found. Glen has spent decades trying to track down Lucan and bring some peace for Sandra's son, who he's known and shared information with since 2008. And today he's here to share that story with us. Glen, you are a successful investigative journalist covering all kinds of stories, but you've lived and breathed this one for a long time, even naming your dog Lucan. What is it about the mystery that intrigues you so much?
Hello, Helen. What is it about Lucan and the Sandra Rivett murder that intrigues me so much? It's a good question. It's because it was unsolved. It's the world's longest running, biggest murder mystery. It continues to captivate people decades down the line. And the evidence suggests that he got away. And that, for me, was the biggest piece of the puzzle, that he did get away. He was protected by a powerful cabal of people, the Claremont set. And it's more than the story about Lucan. It's the story about a young, vivacious woman who was brutally murdered. And it's a story about police corruption and a story about the aristocracy and class. There are so many layers to the Lucan mystery.
What was it that first drew you in?
It was a conversation in a pub about 400 metres from Scotland Yard, which was then based in Victoria in London. And it was a conversation after 2 pints of beer with a detective who had evidence that he'd found that suggested Lucan had got away with it and had got abroad. He said, look, we can't follow this anymore. There's no money in the budget. We've got other murders we've got to investigate. There is not an appetite at Scotland Yard senior management to pursue this. And so you chip away at it. You're a young man, give it 10 years. And that was 30 years ago.
Tell me a bit about Lucan himself. And you mentioned the friends who protected him. He led a pretty aristocratic life, didn't he?
He did, and there's 2 Lucans, really. There's the Lord Lucan, the member of the aristocracy, the blue-blooded son of the 6th Earl. He was a young man who went to Eton. He had everything in life. He was a powerboat racing, horse gambling, card-playing bon vivant. He had a charmed life. And then there's the other Lucan, a young man who really wasn't particularly interested in the opposite sex, who was obsessed with his male cabal, his close-knit friends from Eton, and a young man who wanted money above everything else. And that money for him came from gambling. He gave up a successful career in the city at Brant's, the merchant bank, and he went on a track of, I'm going to make myself a millionaire from gambling. And we all know gambling, you can win some, but you mostly lose. And he lost. The joke is that he lost at just about everything, but it was a slow descent into personal hell for him. And so that man is a dichotomy. There's two sides to him. I've got a photo I can show you here. And this photo was given to me by the detective who burst into Lord Lucan's 2-bedroom Belgravia flat on Elizabeth Street on the night of the murder of Sandra Rivett. And it was found laid on his bed along with a pile of coins, some keys, a passport, and his clothes neatly folded out, as if he was going to come back. Okay, he never did, but this was his passport photo. I'm passing it to you in a kind of a silver sort of cigarette case, and that was given to me by one of the detectives that night who burst in. He gave it to me saying, look, this is the last photo of Lord Lucan, and there you see the jowly 41-year-old lord just before he disappeared forever.
That's extraordinary. That photograph is enough just to draw me in too. You look at this picture, there's something quite haunting about it, and it mirrors the images that you've got. You've got some cuttings there as well on the table, and very similar photograph to the pictures of him in the papers, and you can't help but be drawn in by those cold eyes. What on earth happened?
And of course, those features in that photo, Helen, have come back to be very important now, because with deep face recognition, the ability of computers to analyse a human face, that face there, that photo is one of the photos we ran on our AI program with various universities around the world that gave us a match on the man in Australia.
Well, gosh,
but we may be
to,
slightly jumping ahead.
We're jumping ahead. We've got to unravel this. Just
Indeed.
give me a sense of how extensive your search has been, because some journalists, I'm not suggesting you've done this because you've also been involved in lots of other amazing investigations, but some journalists have made an absolute career and had global travel out of in some ways perhaps hoping they never will find Lucan.
No, you're right. It's a run. There's one of my former colleagues on Fleet Street, a journalist who gleefully wrote that he'd been to 27 different countries around the world and some of the best beaches in the world looking for Lord Lucan, and he was glad he never found him. But that's the nature of the game. That's the story. Lord Lucan sits on a secret list at Scotland Yard called the 100 list. Not many people know about the 100 list, but the 100 list is a list of fugitives who have disappeared into thin air, who are wanted by Scotland Yard, but are believed to have disappeared somewhere else in the world, to have gone to another country. And they remain on the 100 list until they reach 100 years of age. And then, and only then, are they knocked off the list, because it's deemed to be the fact that they'd have either deceased through natural causes or whatever, or they're just too old to bring back. It's the first that Scotland Yard really think about, that they're 100 now, will knock them off the list. Lucan's still at the top of that list.
Is he? And how old would he be if he's still alive? How old is he now?
He was 90. Notice I'm not using the past tense.
You're not.
He was 90 last month in November 2024.
That's extraordinary. Well, your search has taken you all over the world, and I suppose it's difficult to unravel all this because there's so much I want to ask, but I was absolutely gripped by the 3-part special that has just aired on the BBC. Tell me how you first met Neil, Sandra Rivett, the nanny's son.
Neil reached out to me. He sent an email to the BBC. I'd done a couple of programmes for the BBC about Lord Lucan. They were really looking at the evidence that was beginning to emerge then, 10 years ago. That evidence was bubbling up. People's relationships change. They get divorced. They die. They tell secrets to younger family members. We had got 3 bits of new evidence that suggested he'd got abroad and got away with it. And I'd broadcast those. And it was just at the time that the internet was taking off and the BBC website was just in its infancy. And we got 1 million hits on the BBC website for a story we did about the plastic surgeon who had done plastic surgery on Lord Lucan before he disappeared. And so I was given a bit of a free rein to do stories. Neil had just discovered that he was the son of Sandra Rivett. He'd opened a box that his adoptive mother, Audrey, had left for him, and she'd put that box in her bedside drawer, and she'd told him that, look, you know you're adopted, but you need to open the box to find out more about your adoption. And Neil didn't want to open the box. He was happy. He was a young man. He'd had a lovely childhood with his adoptive parents. And so he left it for a year. And then he opened this box. And in the box is a loving mother's mementos. There's his first birthday card, his adoption certificate from convent down in Portsmouth. And then you start seeing newspaper articles from 1974. And he slowly puts this jigsaw puzzle on his kitchen table at home, and he has to make some links because Sandra Rivett, his mum, who was a nanny murdered by Lord Lucan, her maiden name was Hensby. And Neil then puts this jigsaw together and realises what Sandra Rivett got to do with Hensby, my Hensby. And then he realises that she was Sandra Hensby. And so for him, it's a ka-ching moment. He suddenly realises his mother was the victim of one of the biggest unsolved murder mysteries in British criminal history. And he Googles Lucan, and up I pop on the BBC's website. And that's when he reached out and got in touch and said, we need to have a chat.
Glen, how did Neil react when he realised that his birth mum was infamous and had been killed in such a dreadful way and was all over the headlines?
Helen, it was total shock. When he phoned me, he was in shock. And a number of things went through my head, which is, well, you didn't know your mum because she'd given you up for adoption 4 years before she was murdered. And some more empathy managed to come to me. And I sort of thought, well, maybe we should meet up and talk this through. And I actually thought this is a therapy session. Or the other part of me thought he's not telling the truth and I've got a fantasist on the phone. So I went, and Neil and I joke about this now. We're good friends. More than good friends. We've spent a lot of time together. And I said, well, I didn't believe you, to be honest. And so I went down to see him at his place down in Sussex. And we sat down and he showed me the box, and I looked at the box and I put my investigative hat on and I thought, oh, okay, well, he's put this box together pretty well. How could he have got those articles? Well, he could have bought those articles,
Ever the cynic investigative journalist.
Ever the cynic, Helen, ever the cynic. I actually feel guilty now. I've apologised to him since. And then I said, well, what else have you got that proves it? And he's bright. He's a builder. He does house extensions, loft extensions, patios, but he's a very bright man. He has to be, I suppose, because he's constantly logistically juggling a team of 20 or 30 builders. So he's always got projects on the go. So he's used to logistics. And he said, well, I can prove I am the son of Sandra. I said, well, how? This box is good, but how do I know? I'm sorry to ask this question, I have to ask you. He said, well, look, here's my birth certificate. I went to Wales, to Swansea, and got my birth certificate. There's my birth certificate. There's my mother's name. And that was the evidence that he'd got the certificate. And I read that and I thought, wow, okay. So this is a story. And the story is the man who's just discovered he's the son of the murder victim, the nanny.
For those people listening to the podcast, perhaps younger listeners who don't recall exactly what happened, just remind us what happened on that night in November 1974 to Neil's mum.
7th of November 1974. It was at the height of the IRA bombing campaign in mainland Britain. Lord Lucan was estranged from his wife, Veronica, the Countess. They had 3 children. It had been a bitter battle for custody that was ongoing. And on that evening, it was a Thursday night, and Neil's mum, Sandra, was the nanny, a live-in nanny, which was not unusual in Belgravia in those days. And she would live in the house. But Thursday night was unusual because normally it was her night off. But on this particular Thursday, her boyfriend, John Hankins, who's in the documentary series, wasn't feeling too well. So she changed her nights. So she was on duty, and at just before 9 p.m, the Countess asked her to go downstairs into the basement and make a cup of tea, as they always did before they watched the then 9 o'clock news on the BBC. Sandra descends the stairs down into the basement, and she's perplexed because she flicked the light switch and no light came on. So she goes further down to investigate, and that's where, at the base of the stairs, the first attack site took place, where she's brutally attacked from behind by a man with gloves who puts his gloves into her mouth and starts beating her over the head with a lead pipe. She drowns in her own blood on the basement kitchen floor. The gurgling sound was most probably the only noise that was made. There was no screams. The children were 3 floors upstairs. Veronica was 2 floors upstairs. They heard nothing. About 8 to 10 minutes pass, and Veronica comes down to find out, well, what the hell's gone on? Where's my cup of tea? Sandra. She calls out her name, and then she's attacked by the same gloved attacker. And they have a vicious fight on the basement stairs. The blood markings show that he then attacks her and beats her across the forehead with the lead pipe, but she manages to grab him by his genitals, and that basically stops the attack, puts him in a fetal position on the floor where she lets go, and they calm down, and it's her husband. And she goes, "John." They then go upstairs. We don't know what took place, but what we do know is that he tried to mop up her wounds. She sat on the bed. The children were left untouched upstairs, one floor up at the very top of the house. Sandra's dead by now. She's drowned in her own blood in the basement. And basically he has a conversation with her, the contents of which we know a little bit. She tries to placate him. She says, "Look, we can get round this." She's doing anything. She's talking for her life now because she knows that he's murdered or hurt the nanny downstairs. At one point, he goes out either to check on one of the children or to wash his hands and take his gloves off. And at that point, she realises it's her opportunity to escape. She runs down the stairs, out the front door, and 300 yards down the road to a pub called the Plumber's Arms, which she bursts into, covered in blood, screaming, my children are at risk." He then disappears into the night, never to be seen again.
And that's the last time that anybody has really heard from him, or the last time he's seen in public.
So he leaves the house, gets into a borrowed car and drives 40 miles south to Sussex to a place called Uckfield, which is a lovely farming small market town. And he then knocks on the door just after midnight of the 7th. So we're now at 12:05 on the 8th of November. Timelines are really important in this sort of story. And he seeks refuge with an old friend called Susan Maxwell Scott, who's a barrister. Her husband, Ian Maxwell Scott, is a key member of something called the Claremont Set. The Claremont Set were this incredibly powerful small cabal of very powerful rich men who Lucan was involved with politically, financially, and from a leisure perspective. They did everything together, shared secrets, and had unbreakable bonds. And he then leaves Susan Maxwell Scott's house, according to her testimony, which is very, very doubtful, or can be challenged quite easily, and disappears into the night. The car that he's been driving is found abandoned 3 days later down in New Haven, with the other part of the lead pipe found in the boot. So he had 2 bits of lead pipe, both with tapes on. So he had a primary murder weapon and a reserve.
Do you think that he killed the nanny by mistake, given that it was normally her day off, which is what the boyfriend said in your documentary? Do you think the plan all along was to kill Lady Lucan?
Neil is of the opinion that his mum was the original target, and that's based on some factual evidence, good factual evidence. I'm of the opinion that she was the mistaken, that he'd taken the light bulb out of the basement, and Sandra was a diminutive, attractive young woman. Veronica was a diminutive, attractive young woman too. Both of them were in their prime of their lives, both the same height and build, and so he mistook Sandra for Veronica. It was almost an open secret within the Claremont Set that he wanted to murder his wife. She'd had mental health issues. His plan was, he had an alibi set up at a nearby restaurant where his friends were gathering. He'd do the murder, put his wife's body in the boot of the borrowed car, leave it overnight, dispose of it the next day, turn up for dinner that evening with his alibi. That was the plan, and it went horrendously wrong. Neil's of the opinion that his mum knew things, which we know she did. She knew secrets about Lucan, and she was troublesome to him, as was Veronica. So he had a motive to kill both women.
There are so many twists and turns. You unearthed persuasive evidence that one of Lucan's powerful friends helped mastermind a new life for him in Mozambique, I think, under the alias John Crawford. Tell us a bit about that aspect of this very long, complicated investigation that you find yourself on.
Well, the Claremont Set's full of very colourful characters, but the 2 primary members of the Claremont Set were Sir James Goldsmith, Jimmy Goldsmith to his friends, corporate raider, billionaire back in the 1970s and 80s, started the Reform Party, now deceased. And his right-hand man was an equally colourful character called John Aspinall. And John Aspinall was, he started off in London when gambling was illegal. setting up underground gambling dens for the wealthy, the aristocracy. He was a clever man. John would fleece all of these blue bloods who'd come down to London with their father's millions and estates up north and just take the money off them at the gambling tables. So John and Jimmy both knew each other from days at university and from being very young men at Eton. And so in their 20s to their 30s to their 40s, their friendship forged together ideologically and in their love of gambling and the finer things of life. Jimmy Goldsmith's very famous for a quote he once said, which is, when you marry your mistress, you create a job vacancy. So that was a famous quote of his. So that gives you an insight into his approach to life. John Aspinall owned private zoos, Howlett's, down in Sussex and Kent. He owned another zoo down there too, and he was an importer of exotic animals. He would wander around London in the 1960s with a tiger cub. He was an eccentric, but he also was very, very loyal to his friends. He based all of his ethos on African tribal beliefs, that loyalty to friends is the most important thing above all. And he was very loyal to Lucan and very open about his loyalty within their particular Claremont set circle of friends. And so John Aspinall was the man who facilitated Lucan's escape in the early days, and was undoubtedly the man who helped fund him through Africa and on to India and look after him. But of course, John Aspinall died about 15 years ago. And so when the money trail runs out, that's what you have to ask, well, how did Lucan survive after then? Which was a lot of research we did. But Neil and I followed the money. And if you follow the money, you come across the witnesses who talk about the money. And that's where we started making progress post-2010.
And what progress did you make there when you were following the money?
We were following the money, and it was the BBC online articles and BBC documentaries that we did back then, and we do one every 2 or 3 years. And it would be, first of all, Mandy Parks came to us, and she was a 14-year-old babysitter in Uckfield for Susan Maxwell Scott, the barrister. And she got in touch to say, look, I need to meet you and I'd like to meet Neil because I've got some information. I've passed it to Scotland Yard, but I now think I should pass it to you, Neil. We found this along the way, and especially with women, a lot of the people who have helped us progress this investigation are women, because a lot of them are mothers and a lot of them understand what it's like to have or lose your mother. And so Mandy came to us and said, look, I gave Scotland Yard a letter. And the letter was given to my parents by Susan Maxwell Scott 4 days after I'd babysat at the Maxwell Scotts on the 9th of November. The murder was on the evening of the 7th. Mandy was babysitting on the 9th. And when she arrived to babysit, there was a group of aristocrats gathered around a man with a moustache and a trilby hat and a heavy overcoat with suitcases all packed and ready to go. And Mandy's testimony was that that man was Lord Lucan. And she went home, didn't say anything to her parents, but 2 days later, the Maxwell Scott's big Bristol motor car pulled up outside the house. They were farm workers, so it was a class thing. And Susan Maxwell Scott, the barrister, got out and handed a letter to Mandy's dad. And it was only about 7 years later, Mandy had asked her dad, what was in that letter? And it was, tell your daughter she did not see what she saw on the night she was babysitting, and it is our advice that she never speaks a word again of what it was. Now, that's evidence. Why send that letter? Why give that letter to Mandy's parents? And that letter was passed to Scotland Yard far too late, 30-odd years later. But that, for us, and certainly for me and Neil, was Mandy had seen Lucan at the Maxwell Scotts 2 days after the murder. So far from throwing himself into the English Channel or doing the decent thing and committing suicide, 2 days later, we've got him alive, surrounded by luggage, surrounded by the Claremont set, at the barrister's house, Susan Maxwell Scott's house.
So Mandy Parks, the young babysitter, saw him with his suitcases. Who else saw him and gave you any evidence that he escaped rather than took his own life?
Well, after Mandy Parks' interview went out, we were contacted by a woman called Shirley Roby, who was really interesting. Shirley approached us and said, look, I don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to Lord Lucan's son, George, who's waiting to be the 8th Earl of Lucan or Bingham. And we went, well, fair enough, I can put you in touch, but what do you want to talk to him about? She said, I don't want to tell you, I just want his contact details because I know you've been in touch with him. So I passed them over and under BBC rules, fair dealing, and that's what she wanted. About 2 months passed and she came back. She goes, George Bingham didn't want to talk to me. He didn't want to hear what I had to say, but I will now tell you. So I thought, well, fair enough, this is worth it. What have you got to say? And we were quite clinical in our exchange. She's a very businesslike woman. And she said, I, as a young woman, worked at one of John Aspinall's casinos. I was in the management suite. I was the membership secretary. I got very close to John Aspinall and Jimmy Goldsmith, and they asked me to facilitate trips for the children, the 3 children, to Africa, so Lord Lucan could watch them from afar. And I said, what does watch them from afar mean? She goes, he wanted to be there, but he couldn't let them know that he was their father. So he would be part of a group as they went on safari, and he could see his children interact with them, but they must never know that he's their father, because that would implicate them in a potential conspiracy. I said, well, how many times did you do this? She goes, we sent them twice, in 79 and 81. We could only send 2 of the children because the 3rd child, the youngest, was on her mother's passport. And we took them out of boarding school for 3 weeks in Africa each time.
That all sounds very credible, doesn't it?
It does. It panned out. And of course, we asked, well, how can we verify this? And she put us in touch with one of the other people who worked at the casino. We are talking, this is 1980, so a long time ago. And that person verified her story and then said, oh, yes, it was almost an open secret that he was tucked away in Africa at that particular time, looked after by John Aspinall and the safaris that he took his animals from. And so it was for us the final nail in the coffin in a way of course he didn't commit suicide after the murder of Sandra Rivett. He got away with it.
You also secured a rare interview with Lord Lucan's brother, Hugh. What did he tell you, Glenn?
Hugh was a lovely man. You've got to go sometimes, Helen, with keys. When I say keys metaphorically, it's something that unlocks someone, makes them want to talk to you. And sometimes you find evidence that you don't want to find, but we found a police statement in a box of paperwork that was gifted to us by the daughter of one of the original police officers, Davina, and another woman, and Davina has been a powerhouse of help for us. But Davina gave us a box, and in that was a statement that talks about another man living in the house where Sandra was murdered in the days and weeks running up to the murder. We call this the second man statement. But we took that to South Africa, to Johannesburg, and I gave it to Hugh and said, look, there's evidence here that your brother, Lord Lucan, might be innocent. Neil was obviously unhappy with that, but he understood why I had to do it, and it is evidence that there's another man living in the house. Who was he? Why haven't the police traced him? And that unlocked, it was the key that unlocked Hugh. And there began a dance for 3 days. And I say a dance in that he said, let me read it. Let me think about it. Go away, come back tomorrow morning for tea. And we went away. We came back the next morning for tea. He let us in again. We sat down. We talked some more. We talked about the statement, how we'd obtained it, what our aim and objective was. And then he said, go away again and I'll ring you and let you know if I'll do my interview. And he's never done a television interview before, so we were keen to get an interview. And he rang, and true to his word, he said, if you come back tomorrow morning again at 11 with some question areas, we'll sit down in the afternoon and do an interview. And he did an interview, and he did 2 interviews. He did an on-the-record interview, which is filmed, which is in the documentary series, and I think you can see it online, in which he says that his brother probably got away. It's highly likely that he got away. Of course, remember, if Hugh had said, he got away and I've been in touch with him, he's implicating himself into the conspiracy.
He has to be quite careful.
He's dancing a dance, Helen, dancing the dance. And then the second interview is off record. We were packing the kit away, and I was there with a friend of mine who I'd taken over with me to Mozambique and Johannesburg, who's ex-Foreign Office. And Stuart and I have known each other for donkey's years, and he's an ex-Foreign Office person, so he's good at getting into countries and knows people. And Stuart had been doing the camera work for me because we didn't take a crew for budgetary reasons.
That's so typical, isn't
Stuart, it is. Stuart was taking the camera to bits and turning the camera off, and I was looking at him because he was not taking it off the tripod properly. And I was like, we are like an old married couple. We've known each other that long. And Stuart said, what really happened, Hugh? And it went quiet, and I went quiet. And I thought, well, hang on, Stuart, you're stepping me out of your box here. I'm the journalist, you know. And Hugh looked up and he said, he got away. And he's not been in Africa, he's been living in India. I'd gone completely quiet. He said, and he died of cancer in 2008.
So he said he has died.
He did. And he gave some more information about his belief system. That Hugh himself, the brother, was a member of something called the Theosophical Movement, the Theosophical Society. It has principles based on Buddhism, karma, mystic Indian spiritual religions. It's an interesting organisation, Theosophy. Believes in life after death. It believes that in life you can change or make good for the mistakes you've made early on. Interesting in this case, I thought.
Yes.
And Hugh then said his brother had adopted this sort of lifestyle. He didn't say he was a Buddhist, he just said he'd had a 180-degree turn and that he'd realised that his vodka swilling, cigarette smoking, gambling days were over, which they were, and he'd gone to India. And we listened to that, and I was a bit dismissive, but Stuart wasn't. Stuart's been an investigator for a long time, criminal investigator, and on the plane back we talked about it. And that was Hugh's evidence. And when the interview went out on the BBC, front pages in the newspapers, which was good for Neil and I because we'd just set up the website. And so more information came in.
I suppose when all that information's coming in, you have got to be careful of cranks, haven't you? And there's no wonder you thought Neil might not be genuine at the beginning, because in any story like this, a lot of people say a lot of nonsense, don't they?
They do. But funny enough, it's easier to check now because of the internet. What you'll do is someone will send you an email with a load of information in it, and you can verify all that information and see if it's out there in the public arena. And if there's nothing new in there, they've just gone on Google and just ripped it all off. But if there's a little nugget in there that's not on Google, that's not appeared in the internet or isn't in any books or newspaper articles, then you've got to take it a little bit seriously. You've got to bottom it out.
So there's a little thread, a new thread that you can maybe follow. And
a lot of them, when I say a lot, look, we've had 4,000 emails since the series has gone out. It's still doing well on the iPlayer. But out of those 4,000, we've got a little box at home on our computers, Neil and I. There's 109 good leads in those boxes out of that 4,000 emails. So even now, we're still getting leads, and it's from the elderly. When I say the elderly, it's people who are in some orbit, have crossed over into Lucan's world, or their children who are in their 50s and 60s now.
Hold that thought about the leads, because I would like to ask you for a sense of what you perhaps is the strongest lead, or where you're going next. But I feel we're still on this story of now thinking that perhaps Lucan got into Buddhism or lived, I think there was a suggestion maybe he lived a monk's life in India. Was that your next stop?
I dismissed it. So I thought it was farcical. And I thought Hugh was giving us truth mixed with maybe untruth. Stuart thought otherwise, but I just parked it. We came back, the interview went out on the BBC, on to the next bit of evidence, on to the next journey on this story. And then 18 months passed, and Neil gets a box by FedEx courier, and he gets it delivered to his home address, and he lives in the middle of nowhere. I call it Brigadoon because it is a country sort of a glen of a little valley with a pub, a post office, and that's about it. He gets this box and he thinks, well, I don't know anyone in Perth, Australia. Who the hell's this come from? So he opens the box, and in the box is a series of facial recognition drawings, quite rudimentary compared to where science is now, and a long letter and newspaper articles. And it's from a man called Stephen in Perth, in Western Australia. The most isolated city in the world. Did you know that, Helen?
No, I didn't. And you didn't know until you went there, I'm guessing.
Exactly. You just look at it on the map and you realise why it's the most isolated city. It's 5 hours to fly anywhere. But in this box, you see that he's had this man living with him briefly, and he believes him to be Lord Lucan. And their relationship over a 6-month period deteriorates, and there's a drug-induced or alcohol-induced violent act. Stephen ends up having to get a restraining order against this man and his colleague or friend. But at the end of the letter, he says he goes by Buddhist names. And he lists the names. And I think, where have I heard Buddhist? Kaching, Hugh, Africa, He'd changed his life. He'd done a 180-degree turn. And it's at that point that I thought, I've got to tell Neil. And so I said, look, this is weird because Hugh, totally detached, a sterile corridor between Stephen in Perth and Hugh in South Africa, totally sterile corridor. Both of these men are talking about Lucan being a Buddhist. And that for me was a moment that journalistically I now had to take it seriously. And so I told Neil, and so we decided to focus on this Stephen and to do our due diligence, which is what Neil does. He does the due diligence, which is he checks him out online. He'll see whether he's a person of good standing, hasn't had any problems in the past. Can we take him seriously? And he checked out. And their relationship blossomed in that they exchanged more letters and the story developed and we understood more about this man who then was going by the name of Christopher Newman, which we thought was interesting.
Clue in the title there.
Indeed, or Vaja, or was his Buddhist name. And when we then got sent the photos of him, we went, oh. And then Stephen said he speaks with a cut glass English accent. He's from Belgravia. He talks about having gone to Eton as his schooling. He says he knew Princess Margaret and had had access to Buckingham Palace. All of these things check out. Lucan did spend time in Buckingham Palace as a child. They did mix with Princess Margaret in the Claremont Club and in the various aristocracy gambling dens that they all went to and the parties they went to. He did go to Eton. So by now we're like, oh, right.
Was it time to get on an aeroplane, Glenn?
It was, yeah, a long way to go.
It is a long way to go. How did you feel inside when you stepped on that aeroplane, given how much time and effort and dedication you've put into this story?
So it was 2018, it was March 2018, and we arrived at Heathrow Airport, and Neil picked up a copy of the Daily Mail newspaper, and on the front page, spookily, it said, Scotland Yard believe Lucan's still alive, based on intelligence. Neil went, oh my God, are they listening to our phones? You know, we had that kind of like stupid moment. So that was the day we flew. So we were energised. It was a long way to go, but it was more than a punt, wasn't it? I mean, you're a journalist. You've done this sort of work. Two men, both Buddhists, went to Eton, knew Princess Margaret, speaks with a Belgravia cut-glass accent, numerous name changes, now calls himself Christopher Newman. It was almost too good to be true.
And the facial recognition.
Facial recognition then was rudimentary. It was what's called just pencil line. So someone had measured the distance between the eyes. We have since gone through several stages where it's gone from rudimentary facial analysis to what is now something called deep face recognition, which is where we are now with it.
I would have jumped on that plane. I would have been on board.
Well, we went and we met Stephen. And we sat on his veranda and talked, and he showed us the restraining orders against this man, so he checked out. We then decided to see if we could find him. And this is where Neil had come into his own. He'd located Vaja, or Christopher Newman, who was now 2,000 miles away on the other side of Australia.
Of course he was.
in Brisbane. And so we did a 5.5-hour flight from Perth to Brisbane to try and look for him.
There are times in the documentary, and probably this is the time that I'm talking about right now, is that where Neil absolutely seems to turn detective, albeit rogue, going undercover in ways that I think even you and I would think twice about, perhaps. This was the time, wasn't it, when I think your heart was in your mouth, because you like the odd couple, you two. There's a very tender relationship between you. But I sense from the documentary that even you were like, oh my God, hold on here. Because Neil did go a bit rogue now, didn't he?
Absolutely, you're right, Helen. He went rogue. His boundaries are different, aren't they? Because as journalists, we operate within boundaries of people's, their own rights, privacy. You've got to cross some bridges to have justification in what you're doing. For Neil, this is personal. It's his mum.
Yeah.
It's his mum. We did that in unison.
We did.
It's for him. It was almost like, and he'd laugh at this, you have a toddler and you've got those reins and you want to pull the reins that pulls them back slightly. I had to do that. At one point, when we were doorstepping the house, trying to infiltrate it under different names with secret filming glasses on, I was halfway saying, come on, off you go, let's get in there. But at the same time, I wanted us to get out and get out quick, because these are unpredictable environments. And the man, Christopher Newman, had surrounded himself with much younger people who were, I won't say cultish, but they were Buddhists who lived in a commune and had an alternative lifestyle. And he was at the very centre of that as a deity. And they treated him, remember now he's 84, 85, so he's an elderly man. And they treated him as a deity, and he was having a wonderful time. Every need he had, food, water, entertainment, they'd take him out, they'd take him to the Buddhist festivals, the food markets in Brisbane. So he was being well looked after. And so when we infiltrated the house, we got in, but I wanted to get out as quickly as we can. And you see that on the documentary.
Well, you've got your secret filming glasses on. You really couldn't make this up, Glenn. I can absolutely see why you've been so immersed in this story for so long. But what was it like for you when you came face to face with a man who could, because I still don't think we know the definitive answer, who could be a 90-odd-year-old Lord Lucan?
I was interested in just evidence gathering, so my job was to try and get as many close photos of his face for deep face recognition for the algorithms back in London. So my job was quite defined, whereas Neil, totally different kettle of fish. I mean, here he is potentially facing his nemesis. So my job was quite functional, and I was there to get in, get the evidence, get out, and not break cover. Of course, I end up breaking cover by, I think I called Neil his real name instead of the name he was going under.
You did.
So it's me that slipped up, ironically, supposedly the seasoned investigative journalist. Neil didn't. But Neil, I mean, you see him there and he's looking at him. We're looking for scarring on the ears. It exists. We look for the plastic surgery evidence on the nose, which exists. You see it on the secret filming glasses. And then as backup, we use iPhones to get better quality, deeper pixel pictures. Of course, he thinks we're two railway workers popping over, telling them some news about someone he'd known. So our cover story was okay. It lasted until I slipped up on the names and then we got out. But Neil's adamant as you walk out there. My view from day one is that he's a person of significant interest to law enforcement, based on Buddhism, Belgravia, going to Eton, knowing Princess. I mean, stack it up. The plastic surgery scar marks, it all stacks up. For Neil's, it's him. And he had a posh accent. He couldn't hide it. And he walked with a gait of an aristocrat, his hands placed behind his back in a dignified manner.
I think I'm quite cynical on things like this, but when you handed that passport photograph over to me at the beginning of our chat, and when I was watching the documentary on TV, it so easily could be an old Lord Lucan. Even if he's had some surgery, there were striking similarities, I thought, with the man that I only really know from the headlines and the newspapers. But have you still been left, Glenn, thinking you've still got to pursue this because you're not 100% sure?
Good question. The way it's ended is that the BBC, separate from us, got an interview with Christopher Newman.
Love the way you say Newman.
Over in Australia, and he denied that he's Lord Lucan, but gave no real evidence as to who he was and couldn't explain why he'd had 7 name changes. He'd done so by deed poll as well, in various states in Australia. If you change your name in Australia by deed poll, under their privacy laws, some of the strictest in the world, it takes 7 years for that to come out on public record. Interesting, isn't it? So if you want to change your identity and not be found out, you just change it, and every 7 years you change your name again. But I digress. What do I think? Neil, in a way, solved it again, because in the very last week before the documentary was broadcast, and we identify a man in Toronto as being Christopher Newman as a young man, so not Lord Lucan, Neil ran AI again. And the 2 photos of the young man in 1969 in Toronto and our Christopher Newman in Australia, they came out with a hit rate of 12%. Not 75 or 89%, which is what we got when we compared the photo of the original Lord Lucan with Christopher Newman, but 12%. That's what's called a fail. So it's not a match. Now that's on Neil's website at the moment. So it's not a match if you believe or trust AI. As for the man himself, he's still over in what can only be described as a very isolated ranch out in the outback, way up north from Brisbane now, surrounded by his acolytes. And his last words were, even if I am Lord Lucan, what the are you going to do about it?
So what are you going to do about it now? You said you've got 109 new leads. Where does the story go for you and also for Neil?
In Australia, you can do a private prosecution to get someone to prove who they are definitively in the courts. That's an option open for Neil. It's an option open for John Hankins. Neil's mum's boyfriend in 1974, John Hankins, is as much emotionally invested in this as Neil Berriman is. And those two are now trailing their path forward. Neil's going to go and see Scotland Yard in the new year to talk to them. And we also want to talk to the Australian Federal Police, who have seen this man, popped round to see him. They measured him. Apparently they laid him on the floor and measured him, and he's too short to be Lord Lucan, and he has flared ears, and Lord Lucan does not have flared ears. Neil, being Neil, has gone to the GMC, the medical council, and what do you do when you get old? You shrink in height, and your ears grow out and flare. So Neil's view is, easily explained. And this is where we are. It's not purgatory. We're in a place whereby we can't definitively prove through DNA that this man is Lucan or not Lucan, because we don't have any DNA to compare it against. There is no DNA from 1974. And when the Scotland Yard went to Lucan's family, 3 children who now live in London, they had the right to deny giving DNA, to say we can't or don't want to give our DNA for a comparator, and they all denied it. They didn't want to give DNA, which is their right legally. They are as much victims in this as Neil Berriman is. They lost a father. In a way, they lost their mother too, because mentally she descended into a serious illness after being beaten around the head and nearly murdered. So they're as much victims.
You've got to admire Neil. He even corresponded with Lady Lucan at one point, didn't he? So he feels like he's left no stone unturned.
They had an online relationship where they emailed each other, and she says it was our first insight into the relationship between the nanny, the downstairs servant, and the Countess. They were friends. Sandra took Veronica one evening on a Friday night to one of John Hankins' pubs. He was a pub manager, and they pulled pints behind the bar laughing. Countesses don't normally do that. Veronica really enjoyed that. Veronica and Sandra, although only knowing each other for 3 months before Sandra's murder, had become friends because they were 2 women, both of whom had suffered domestic violence, and both of whom were united in trying to protect those 3 children from a quite insidious campaign that Lord Lucan had launched on the house using private detectives to intimidate Veronica. He was trying to get the children into custody, his custody. And so late night phone calls, heavy breathing down the phone. It was a very acrimonious breakup, the marriage, before the murder of Sandra Rivett.
Right at the beginning, when you summed up the elements of this story, you said police corruption. Where did the police corruption come in, Glen?
Good question. The police corruption took place from the very first hour after the murder. And it was a case of the police station in Belgravia was called Belgrave Police Station. And opposite it lived Noel Coward, the actor. They treated that police station as their own personal police station. This is the aristocrats, the actors, the millionaires who lived in Belgravia at that time. Noel Coward would send champagne every Christmas to the policemen because he used them all the time for his own purposes. Those police officers, it was the plum posting in London to be at Belgrave Police Station because you only had to look after the aristocrats and the millionaires. Now, we know that there was another man living in the house, staying overnight in the house before the murder. We have the witness statement from one of the children, who was, I think, 11 at the time, so not a baby. And she says, there's a man living in the house. Sometimes he stayed in the nanny's room. Sometimes he stayed with mummy. Now, that man we've traced, and this is where we are in our investigation, we've traced him as being a police officer. And so there was a police officer in the house before the murder. Now, that never came out. And for me, that's an explanation as to why maybe Scotland Yard didn't do as thorough a job as they could have done. I personally believe that it was convenient that Lucan just vanished and disappeared for everybody.
You still have Lucan because your dog's called Lucan. Do you get funny looks at all, Glenn, when you shout Lucan on the where are you on the playing fields?
Less so, purely because anyone who remembers the Lucan story now has to be a certain age, although we have managed to open it up to a whole new generation online. But no, the girls, I've got 3 daughters, and they called him Lucan because Dad's always looking for Lucan.
That's so sweet. So this is going to carry on for you. I mean, we're just about to enter a whole new year. Do you carry on with that same determination and interest, Glenn?
I think sometimes you've got to have breaks, and certainly we need a break now, and we will. We've got 108, I think,
109,
emails.
you said? 109.
109 emails, which are really promising emails. That's 109 people that have got to be phoned or seen who've got real credible information and intelligence. And Neil's so grateful to those people, and there are more out there. And people are beginning to give up the secrets that they were told by their auntie or their mum or their dad. It's almost an open secret he got away. We've got the evidence he got away now. His own brother told us he got away. So he got away, but what happened to him?
And you still talk in present tense. If I put you right on the spot, do you think, whether that was Lucan or not that you found in Australia, in your gut, Glenn, do you think Lord Lucan is still alive?
There's 2 endings to this story.
That's cheating.
You told the story that he died of cancer in 2008, and he told us where. And he even went as far as saying his ashes were scattered under a tree, a particular tree. Okay. Detail, devil's in the detail. Or he got away and he got to Australia or somewhere else. Now, the man in Australia denies he is Lord Lucan, and that is his story, and that's what he's saying, despite AI evidence from MIT in America and several universities in the UK saying that it is the same man. He denies it. So it's one or the other. Which one?
It's yes or no. Beautifully ended, Glenn. It's been great to talk to you, and it's just a fascinating story, and incredible that 50 years on, we still don't really know what happened, and yet it's still capturing everybody's imagination. But your story was so different because of Neil's connection, and as we both said in unison earlier on in the interview, it's his mum. And so hopefully Neil will get some resolution and peace at some point too.
Totally. It comes down to, he says, how far would you go if it was your mum? To the ends of the earth.
You have been listening to investigative journalist Glen Campbell on his search for Lord Lucan, the subject of a brilliant 3-part documentary series, Lucan. It's on BBC iPlayer and is well worth a watch. And believe me, we haven't given it all away. There's so much in it. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours. We're taking a break for the holidays, but there are lots of Convex Conversations to enjoy with guests like Formula One legend Sir Jackie Stewart, Line of Duty's Vicky McClure, impressionist Rory Bremner, as well as scientists, explorers and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Join me next year when we'll be joined by the UK's first hijab-wearing jockey, trailblazer 24-year-old Khadija Mello.